Long ago, in the lands of Europe, when aurochs and wild boars and lions and bears still roamed the lands, before man had settled and built the first castles and cities and settlements, when alone there was only tribes. And these tribes, numerous and diverse, lived in the forests and the hills and the caves and in the mountains, some along the coasts, and some along the plains, and the meadows and the groves. And of all these tribes, among all these tribes, each shared one commonality, where each of them would choose a bird that would represent them, that would be the emblem of their tribe, the symbol by which they present themselves to other tribes and other peoples. And some would choose songbirds of all varieties of colors, some red, some blue, orange, green, gray, black. Because of the beauty of their song, they would choose them. Others preferred wiser birds, birds that were much more clever and intelligent, so ravens, crows, even owls. And then, of course, there were tribes who would choose the most fearsome and fastest of the birds, the hawks, the kestrels, the tiercels, the falcons, and the eagles. And all of these tribes had these birds that would represent them, would often be very proud and consider them almost sacred to them. And oftentimes, when tribes encountered, eventually there would always be small debates and small arguments of whose bird was better, which was the best, which one was greater. And this would always be a mark of great pride among the tribes. And in this long past, once, all of the tribes gathered together. And when they gathered together at a central plain, they started to discuss amongst themselves. The wise men, the chiefs, the sages, and the elders of the tribes began to discuss, because it was important to know which of the birds was the king of the birds, which was the greatest of them all. And, of course, those who had the songbirds would say, well, beauty is the most important value, so of course it is our songbirds. And then others would say, no, it is wisdom, it is intelligence, cleverness that is most valuable, most important. So they would say they're owls, they're crows, they're ravens. And then, of course, others would say, no, it is power, it is speed, it is tenacity that proves the greatest of the birds. And so they would argue their case for falcons and hawks and the rest. And this debate went on for days, for weeks, for nigh a month of constant debate and argument every day. And so fierce was the debate that eventually it seemed that battle, that war would break out because of the insults that were constantly levied at one another. And seeing this, a young man of one of the tribes, a young man who had been watching and listening to all of this debate and to all of these arguments, eventually, very humbly, approached the elders, approached the sages, and he spoke to them. He said, pardon me, chiefs, elders, sages, wise men of our tribes. If you will allow me, I have an idea of how we could possibly settle this issue. And the wise men, haughty and proud, looked upon this young man, this little strapling, stroked their beards, and scratched their heads, and considered, and eyed him with a glare. But eventually said to the young man, go ahead, speak, give us your suggestion. And the young man, humbly, candidly, spoke up. We face war with these ceaseless debates, masters, but I have an idea. Perchance a competition, a contest, wherein we set all of our great birds to flight, and sit them and watch them go into the heavens, high and high and high. And then the last of them to descend, we will proclaim the king, the greatest of all the birds. And then the masters, the sages, the chiefs considered and finally agreed. They agreed to the idea that in 1 year's time they would all reconvene. And once reconvened, they would have this contest to see the truth of the matter, see which is the greatest of them all. And the tribes scattered. They all returned to their homes, to their plains, to their hills, to their mountains, to their coastlines, their riversides, and the deeps of the forests. But little did they know, little did they pay attention, and none would have noticed. A little bird, the smallest bird of all, a bird that had never been selected by any tribe to represent them. The wren had been watching, had been listening, had been considering and pondering everything, had watched the tribes convene, gather, argue, debate, and had heard the idea of the young man. And the little wren waited that whole year. And eventually, as was agreed, all the tribes gathered in the central plain once again. And in this year they had bred the finest of birds, with the most luscious of colors, the greatest of wings, and had trained them constantly, and had made them strong, capable, fast, swift. And they arranged all the birds in a great line, the songbirds and the pigeons and the ravens and the crows, the owls, the kestrels, the hawks, the falcons, and the eagles, all of them arranged in a long line. And one of the old men of the tribes said to another young man and told him, "Ready the bow, ready the arrow." And he readied the arrow that was flaming. And the young man was watching. The young man who had had this idea was watching nervously, waiting to see what would occur. But then, right before the competition was to begin, the little wren that had been watching, no one had noticed, but it had snuck through, had gone around, had weaved in between the children and the women and the soldiers and the men, and next to the eagle, as it was fanning its wings in all its pride, the little bird jumped in and hid among the plumage of the eagle and hung on. And then suddenly, one of the elders gave the signal, and the bow let loose, and the arrow flew swiftly. And then, with a great whoosh, all of the birds at once flew into the air, and into the sky dove, and sped swiftly, rapidly. They went as fast as they could, with all of their strength. And they went high, high, high. But sadly, first the pigeons and the songbirds came down. They grew tired too quickly. They were not made for that. And then the wisest also began to fall. The ravens, the crows, and then finally the owls descended. And then amongst all the raptors, they continued on forward, haughty and tough. And then even they began to descend. First the hawks, the kestrels, and the tiercels, and then finally it was only the falcon and the eagle, proudest of all, strongest of all, fastest of all. And they went past the clouds and higher still, until even the falcon grew tired and began to descend. And the eagle, arrogant and so prideful, continued on upward, even though it had already won. It had seemingly already been crowned king in its eyes. And it kept going higher and higher until it passed another set of clouds, and then finally said, "Enough, I have proven myself." And finally was to descend. And at the moment, at the peak, as it began to turn, the little wren jumped. It leaped with a little whoosh, almost imperceptible. And the eagle descended. And as the eagle descended, it bellowed out a great screech that was heard amongst all the plains, all the birds, all the forest heard the eagle. And first the old men began to cheer and to sing its praises as it fell upon the arm of one man, of its trainer. And all began to say, "The eagle is the king, it must be." But then a little song was heard in the wind, the slightest of songs, but the most beautiful. And the trills and the coos began to reverberate through the field as the smallest of birds descended. And the young man looked up and saw this little bird. And he told all the rest, "Quiet, quiet, listen, see." And the little wren fell among all of them, descended slowly and sprightly. And when it was finally on the ground, the young man came to it, and in his two hands picked up the little wren. And before all the great tribes, before all the birds, held it up and said, this little wren, this little songbird, is the kinglet, the king of all birds.